We came up with one simple idea. The homepage of every bank in the world was the accounts page. And so we had this idea that was sort of inspired by the likes of Facebook, which was that you should have an infinite scrolling feed of your financial life and your non-financial life. So every activity that happens that's to do with your life should be available in a feed, but it's obviously focused on your banking. And this thing we called the activity feed. There is not a bank today that has launched in the last, say, 5 years that hasn't launched with an activity feed.
Did you have a bank passport as a kid? Remember how good it felt to deposit a crisp $10 note into your account after you washed the car on the weekend? But now that I've got kids of my own, I do feel instant relief that I can digitally transfer money to them so they can get the bus home. Nowadays, we don't think twice about punching a few numbers into our phone to instantly move our hard-earned cash around. But if you zoom out a bit, this modern convenience is barely a decade old. It's almost as if how we manage our money changed overnight. But now I can't imagine life any other way. Shortly, fintech entrepreneur Dom Pym, a man who's fought off a few curveballs to launch the cutting-edge banking technology we all use. Two decades ago, Dom Pym found himself caught up in a freak event. One of those moments that only happens to people in the movies, maybe people on the news. He'd been living quite an extraordinary life up until that point, sort of as a bit of a child prodigy, a Doogie Howser of sorts of the software world. And this was right as the world's most enterprising people were building this thing called the World Wide Web. But Dom was jolted out of this excitement and this buzz of the 90s tech boom by a freak event. Dom, where were you in September 1999?
We were coming into land probably around 1:30 a.m, I reckon. And so it was dark. It was like a typhoon or something. It was, windy and raining and really horrible. And it was just a normal landing. Like they're just coming into the airport. Someone said over the loudspeaker, "Hi, welcome to Bangkok. It's 19 degrees outside." That was it. Like then all of a sudden, everything went slow-mo. There were panels falling out of the ceiling. There was air conditioning units falling out of the ceiling. There were people screaming. There was just absolute chaos. It went black. You sort of rocked all over the place, and looking at my wife next to me, wondering. They say your life sort of flashes before your eyes, but looking at my wife, I was worried about her safety. Looked out the window. Looked like there were broccolis or something, and they were just sort of like being chopped by the wings. We thought maybe it was smoke or something. We just had no idea. And so, we sort of overshot the runway as the official declaration of plane crash.
And so what was going on in your mind, even in those moments where you thought, look, something has happened here. I think I'm going to live. But did it give you some sense of, wow, life is short?
Absolutely. Like in the moment itself, you have absolutely no idea what's happening. It's very strange. As it progressed on, we saw, people getting injured or, like I said, we saw panels falling out of the ceiling, things like that. Like as it progresses on, you start to realize, I guess, acclimatize to what's happening around you. But in the moment, people say your life flashes before your eyes. Not really for me. I mostly was worried about myself and the people around me. And I was just sort of concerned as to what was really happening. Yeah, just trying to acclimatise, trying to understand what's going on and why is it different than what you sort of expected. The realisation for me of what had actually happened was at the end when we'd stopped and we were just sitting in darkness and there was just absolutely nothing and everyone had stopped screaming. There was no talking. There was just nothingness. And you thought, am I dead? And then someone came running out of the cockpit and just the flight attendants came out and they just started screaming, "Sit down, stay down, sit down, stay down, sit down, stay down." And that's when it sort of hit us that we'd been in a plane crash.
So this is quite a life-changing moment that not many people experience. What was your mindset like in the days after that? What started to tick over for you personally?
Well, there's a few different things. Like there were different events that are sort of, I guess, instilled in memory that you can't forget, the moment when they came out of the cockpit or later on afterwards when we got to the airport. So we had to go down the emergency chutes, like outside, down the life slides or whatever they call them. And because of the way that the plane had sort of overshot the runway, ended up in sort of a perimeter road in a golf course or something, the actual plane was quite deep in the mud, so the life rafts sort of couldn't come out of the plane at the tail end. So everybody had to sort of be ferried down to the front, and then at the front, one of the slides was stuck up in a tree. So there was only really one slide to get 302 passengers out of. I think it was 302 or 312 or something like that, and everybody had to sort of go down this slide and then end up sort of knee deep in a swamp, which is a really weird sort of thing to remember. But the thing that really is just sort of crystallized for me is that somebody tried to light a cigarette. And I got very upset in that moment because there's aviation fuel floating around. There's this aeroplane in front of us that sort of lost a couple of engines and has a a tree sticking through the fuselage and all that sort of stuff. And you look around and someone tries to light up a cigarette. So that was another moment where we felt maybe our lives were not safe yet. And then when we got to the airport, they wanted to, we were sort of classed illegal aliens. So the other thing was the confiscating of the passports, which was really sort of a bit jarring. And then I actually rang up my my mum and let her know we're okay. And I rang my wife's mum as well, and they had a chat. And my wife's mum was, she was wondering what was happening because she hadn't heard, after we'd spoken to her, she hadn't heard for a while. So she rang up the talkback radio and said, "Hey, what's happening with that Qantas plane crash?" And it just went silent, is what I heard later, as they said, "What Qantas plane crash? What are you talking about?" "Oh, my daughter and my son-in-law were in a plane crash. I just wanted to get an update." And so suddenly the media was the next thing we remember, because every newspaper, every radio station, every TV network, they all wanted to talk to these people that had been in a plane crash. And that was pretty exhausting. And, my mum has all the clippings, and I ended up in the hotel room. They put us up in a hotel, ended up in the hotel room vomiting and just shaking with sort of shock and feeling really horrible. So we just locked the door and then didn't answer the phone and just wouldn't talk to anyone after that. But yeah, it's certainly an experience. It's not something you expect, and we never wanted to fly again after that.
I'll bet. So what was life like leading up to that moment? You were sort of on this trajectory with a company called SAP, one of the huge, big, SAP's known in a lot of companies as, a system that a lot of companies use. How did you become involved in that software land?
I think that at the time they were the second largest software company in the world behind Microsoft. So pretty well known, certainly in the enterprise software space. It was a bit of a fluke, really, because I was studying at university and not sure exactly what I sort of wanted to do. And I wasn't sure who to work for. So I asked the university, who are the top employers in technology in Australia and in the world? And I just went and interviewed with all of them. So, Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, Siebel, I can't even remember, Digital, Compaq. There were all these, amazing companies at the time, some of which don't exist today, and others that, have gone on to become trillion-dollar companies. And SAP was really attractive to me because they basically powered every other brand that I knew. So every brand of the Fortune 500 and any of the big brands that I sort of grew up with in Australia, that they were the enterprise software firm that were powering all the systems that made it possible for you to shop at Woolies or, mine ore out of the ground or, jump on a plane or a train. Like all the things that were happening were being sort of powered by them. And so I thought that'd be a really awesome place to work. Not so much at the time realizing that SAP was awesome, but more that the companies that they were powering were awesome. And maybe one day I'd want to work there. So I kind of sort of fluked into it. And then within the first year at SAP, I think I was maybe the second highest billing consultant in Australia, and they didn't have an undergraduate program. So I became the youngest employee at 19 and the first undergraduate that they'd employed. And they just sort of threw me in the graduate program because they didn't have anywhere for me.
This is really fascinating to me because not only are you in the right company at the right time, not only are you kind of the right age to really sink into work at the right time, you're also in the right moment in history because this is sort of the 90s when this whole internet thing is really taking off. And people talk about Bill Gates, being this amazing person, but ultimately he was also in the right place at the right time. Had he grown up 100 years ago or 100 years into the future, he wouldn't be, one of the world's most famous people. So what was it like being, I guess, at the center of this boom? You're at the center of the company, you're at the center of this boom globally. Who are you meeting? What are you learning?
So I ended up settling in Silicon Valley for a little while. And this is pre-Google. Can you imagine a world that didn't have Google? Like, we walk around Silicon Valley. We stayed in sort of this hotel resort sort of thing and rode our bikes to the office. And there were like horses and cows in the paddocks. And in amongst all these, the valley, in amongst all these sort of hills, or more than hills, more than mountains, there were just these sort of hidden away tech companies. And a lot of at the time we were in Palo Alto, a lot of Palo Alto was sort of Hewlett-Packard and Stanford University. And then just these sort of little hidden gems. And you just sort of come across, you sort of just pass over the crest of the hill and then, on your bicycle or in your electric car or whatever, and suddenly you'd open up into this world of technology. And so, it was an amazing experience. And I would probably say there's a couple of things. One is that SAP was the second largest software company in the world at the time. That's amazing. But there was this small thing called the internet, right, that I think you mentioned before, right? It was just sort of coming along, and it was all client-server architecture then. So the founder of SAP is a sort of famous speech where he got up and said, what we want to do is find a way to reinvent ourselves so we can be number one in this e-commerce space, in the web, and not just in the enterprise space. We really want to sort of be able to dominate.
And tell me how you first got into software, because you were this kind of wunderkind, like you could do all this coding and this software development from quite a young age. How did you get into it? What did mum and dad do for a living? We
didn't have a sort of a lounge room or a TV or anything when I was growing up, so I didn't have time to waste like everyone else. I had to find ways to fill in my time. And one way for me to do that was to go around to my mates' places and hang out with them, because they all had computers and I didn't. And so my brother and I actually did a lot of sort of odd jobs and things like that in order to save up for our first computer. And then my dad bought a computer from the Trading Post, but that was like his computer, and it was a green screen. It ran DOS, and I think we had WordPerfect. So there wasn't really a lot we could do with it. I think we had
You're
something.
You're taking me back to my high school days.
Yeah.
I had a 286 with WordPerfect.
Oh yeah, it's classic. And we had a game. We got an Apple IIe at one point, and we had a game on it called Conan the Barbarian. And it's awesome
I played
game.
Top Cat.
Yeah, well, but those games were sort of, very different to the games nowadays. It was all about the gameplay because the graphics weren't really that awesome. But, a lot of energy and effort went into making those games really good fun. So because we didn't have a tally and we didn't have a computer until a bit later in life, I think I was 16 when I bought a computer with my brother, it meant that I'd go around to my mates' places. And my mates' dads were right into technology. So my best mate's dad at primary school, was a real computer nerd and also into financial markets and all that sort of stuff. And then at high school, my best mate's dad basically taught me everything I know about computers. I mean, he died, unfortunately. I remember doing the eulogy. His kids were overseas, and I did the eulogy at his funeral, and I couldn't stop crying. And he's not my dad, but he was like a surrogate dad, because he taught me everything I knew about computers, like everything. I'd just sit there fascinated watching him just write code or pull apart a computer or get out his soldering iron or whatever it was. And, it really inspired me. His kids were more interested in playing computer games or flight simulators or whatever, whereas I was right into just learning how the computer works, why it works that way, how to pull it apart, how to fix it, and then how to write code. And some of the early code that we wrote were, using things like Visual Basic, which, nowadays you look at it and sort of scoff and say that's not real coding, but it sort of taught us the basics, pun intended. And then we moved on to Java and I did assembly and all sorts of other things, COBOL and all sorts of other stuff we learnt at university and we just tinkered with. But I think those early formative years in late sort of primary school and early high school, at our primary school, we had one Apple IIe and it would roll around on a big trolley. And that was it. That was the computer department, one computer. So it was hard to get computer time in order to learn those things. And when I went to my mates' places, fortunately their dads worked in computers and I was able to sort of get that exposure.
You must have learnt a lot in an incredibly short period of time, because I think about now kids are exposed to coding in primary school, everyone's got a laptop at school, all of those things. You're there sort of tinkering in the back end of a computer with your mate's dad. But in order to be a very successful software engineer at SAP not very long later, so you must have been on this rapid trajectory of knowledge.
I mean, you're just a sponge when you're that age. I think between the age of sort of, say, 12 and 16, till I had my own computer, I just read a lot of books. I was like, read every book in the local library. There was just nothing left. And just tried to absorb everything. And it was a passion. And I've sort of volunteered at the local computer shop as well. And so then over time, I had an opportunity to pull apart computers and put them together and just teach myself. I mean, it was definitely a different time, that there was no one to teach you those things. I was fortunate to have those sort of role models, and one of them had come out of the army, and the other one had been very successful in the financial markets, and it sort of had almost out of necessity. The financial markets were moving very quickly and were digitizing, and then when they were working in the military, they had to build this type of technology, from scratch. So I was very, very fortunate to have mates with such awesome dads. That was sort of a fluke. And then one of my best mates, so I still have a group of friends. We sort of call ourselves the gang. We went to kindergarten together, and one of my best mates who went to kindergarten with me, his dad worked at the CSIRO. We have so many amazing stories of innovation and disruption and creativeness that happened out of the CSIRO, and I got to experience that firsthand. So he invented the polymer in the plastic note, and that's all around the world now. He invented the polymer that's in paint. Anything you see that's painted, invented in Melbourne at the CSIRO. Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is from the CSIRO. In fact, it mostly funds the CSIRO now, the royalties and things. So, like carbon fibre was another one. Every satellite, every aeroplane, everything you sort of know about carbon fibre, it's all invented here in Australia. So that was just my mate's dad. And he did it for 50-something years. One of the things he had as a hobby was this sort of James Bond briefcase. And when you open it up, inside it was a computer. We had to code on it in assembly because it didn't have any sort of, operating system or whatever. So that was just when we were probably less than 12. That was just my best mate's dad had one of these lying around, and we just started playing with it. I remember the first thing we built was a mouse driver so that we could actually make the cursor move on the screen. Sounds really rudimentary, but that led us into then starting to build little games and things. And my mate did most of the hard work. I mostly watched him and sort of just tried to absorb it and learn it. But I think it gave us a bit of a foundation of curiosity. How do these computers work? How do we control them? How do we actually program them to do the things that we want them to do? I mean, that was definitely foundational for me.
And a sense, I imagine, of experimenting, risking, try again, failing on stuff. Like there just to me seems to be a sense of play in what you were doing, and making mistakes, was part of the journey, right? We've sort of lost that sometimes now, or certainly in certain companies, it's all about just executing KPIs, etc. How important was that mucking around time?
Oh, massive. Nowadays we call it agile, right? But back in the day it was just having fun. I mean, to contrast, I mentioned my dad bought something out of the Trading Post. The Trading Post was like the Bible. My brother bought a motorbike. We bought our tennis rackets, our cricket set. We bought little, Donkey Kong games, whatever. Like everything came either from the local Sunday market or out of the Trading Post, and then you'd pull it apart and try and make it work and put it back together again. So it wasn't just software and computers. It was also the physicalness, like building a motorbike from scratch and then turning it into a billy cart, or, what my brother had this little Mitsubishi Colt. But, to get it working, we bought it out of the Trading Post, came around on the back of a van or back of a ute or whatever, and then we took it to my uncle's mechanics workshop and we pulled the whole thing apart, put it back together and drove off. And we ended up with a bucket, like an ice cream bucket of parts left over. And every single person in our gang, learned to drive in that car. So there was a sense of curiosity and passion and disruption, but also a sense of accomplishment, like to actually build a car or a motorbike or a billy cart, or, pulling apart the Game Boy and then putting it back together. Like those sort of things are sort of things, I don't know, kids don't think to do that now because everything's disposable. You buy a Nintendo Switch, you wouldn't really think about pulling it apart and hacking it. You just sort of buy it, use it, and then you buy the next one.
I want to fast forward to Upbank, which eventually becomes your great startup success story. I'm wondering why you took all that software knowledge, the knowledge of building things, all the things that you'd done as a developer, into the financial sector, which is actually notoriously a very conservative space.
I don't know if it was originally sort of by fluke, but when I was at SAP, I sort of worked at all of the big four banks on their big, enterprise systems or their banking ledgers. And so I sort of just got a little bit of experience in my late teens, early 20s. Then I didn't do anything in the sort of fintech space for probably a decade. And my business partner and I at the time we built the world's first grain exchange and we wanted to raise some capital. And when we went off to meet with the bank, the managing director at the bank, Mike Hurst, at the Bendigo Bank, he said to us, could you do what you're doing in the commodities game, in the sort of this grain industry? Could you do what you're doing there, but do it in banking? And not only did I say, no worries, there's only the two of us, I don't know how we're going to do it, but we said, yeah, no worries. But I'd also been tinkering, knowing that I was meeting the managing director of the bank, and we built this little presentation saying, what are our frustrations with banks? and how could you build a bank of the future, and what would a bank of the future sort of look like. And that was around the time that iPhones had come out. They just launched the App Store, and we were just sort of thinking about what the future might look like. And we thought that the future might look mobile, and we also thought that the future might look digital. And so he was taken because, first of all, we did the prep before the meeting. Even though we went to get capital, we sort of digressed into that. And
for a whole different business.
A totally different thing. And he just loved that like so much that we ended up exiting the other business and focusing on solely on sort of this fintech, this idea about building a bank. And it's really funny because, the early stages of that were you meet the managing director, and what effect does a managing director have in a business of 6,000 or 7,000 people? Well, what he was able to do was say, hey, you should go and meet these other people. And he introduced us to two people. One was Marnie, who's the current managing director. And at the time, I can't remember, she was the chief customer officer or something like that. And we sort of thought of her as the 2IC, second in charge at the bank. And he introduced us to her. And for a decade now, she's been our sponsor and supporter. It's extraordinary. But we also met a couple of other people. Andrew Cairns, he was the head of their sort of community bank initiative, and a couple of other people. In the discussions with those people, we sort of pitched them this idea that we would see if we could build a prototype or a proof of concept. And unbeknownst to us, they sort of had issued a tender to launch a new internet mobile banking system. And they had all the usual suspects pitching for it, IBM, SAP, Sandstone, I can't remember, Oracle, all the different companies that were pitching. And we came along and said, just the two blokes, we could probably have a crack at this. So in having those conversations, we ended up in sort of the situation where everyone else said it was impossible. You can't integrate with a 1960s or 1980s or whatever mainframe, and you won't be able to do all those things. You need to get a new core banking system. You need to build a new platform. You need to build middleware. You need to build a new customer experience, new user interface. You're going to need a dedicated mobile app, all this sort of stuff. What a lot of poppycock. Like, we thought these guys are just trying to make a lot of money. We're only two blokes, but we reckon we could put it together and we could prove ourselves. And we built a prototype that took the transactions out of the core banking system and used 4 different methods. Like, we didn't just want to say it can be done, even though everyone else says it can't be done. We did 4 different methods to pull the managing director's data out of the core banking system and present it in a web browser. So it sounds pretty simple, but everyone else said it was impossible.
And how did you also convince them that a part of it is transforming the customer experience? Because people were starting to have, all the banks were starting to have their own apps and whatever, but the genius of UpBank, if people haven't used it, as a mobile banking app, it's orange and yellow and it's bright and it's easy to use, and like my kids have it because it looks nice and fun. How did you convince a traditional bank, Bendigo Bank, to revolutionise how it looked to the customer as well as what the back end would do?
So we actually spent a decade working with Bendigo building their mobile and internet banking system for their 2 million customers, right? So we actually did that for 6 years before we'd won the trust of Bendigo Bank to actually take the leap of faith into building the Up. Up is the reimagined version. So our little company was called Ferocia. We actually sold last year to Bendigo Bank after working with them for a decade to the day, by the way. On the 1st of September.
Congratulations.
It was beautiful. On the 1st of September.
Nice.
Yeah. Unbelievable. And the 31st of August was our 10th anniversary. So what happened was we worked for 6 years with the bank to build their mobile and their internet banking system for their 2 million customers. And then we had built the relationships, the trust, the track record. We'd talked to the regulators. We built relationships with people in the industry, and we built a team. By then we were probably 20, 25 people. Now, we did a lot of innovative new things in that banking platform. I'll give you an example. In 2012, we started that project. In 2011, we started the company, but in 2012, the project with Bendigo started. And then by 2014, we were ready to launch this new banking app or this banking platform on the world. And it was interesting because we built it as a digital platform, as a sort of web app, but it was also a mobile app. And that was pretty revolutionary at the time. A lot of people do that now, but to have the single platform that ran on Android, ran on iOS, and ran in the web browser. And we were over in Barcelona at a banking conference, and it was a few days before we were going to launch it in Australia. And so I got up on stage, and Anson did too, but I was like the keynote speaker or whatever, and got up and did this big presentation about this new banking platform that we're going to launch. Remember, this is 2014. So there were no neobanks or digital banks really around the world of any note. We came up with one simple idea, is that, the homepage of every bank in the world was the accounts page. You'd land on the accounts page and you'd have all your accounts laid out. In America, they call it a checking account. We might call it a transaction or a savings account or whatever. And so we had this idea that was sort of inspired by the likes of Facebook, which was that you should have an infinite scrolling feed of your financial life, but both your financial life and your non-financial life. So every activity that happens that's to do with your life should be available in a feed, but it's obviously focused on your banking. And this thing we called the activity feed. There is not a bank today that has launched in the last, say, 5 years that hasn't launched with an activity feed, right? So we invented that idea. We created that idea. Nobody else had that. Everybody had landed on the thing. So we did do innovative, interesting things, but it was for a pretty traditional bank in a pretty traditional market. It has to be mobile only in the first instance, at least, and it has to cater for a very niche, specific audience rather than be everything for everyone. And I think that's the sort of genesis of why Up needs to be so awesome, because we're sort of specifically building it for the people that are comfortable doing mobile banking and that are sort of living on the edge of the future. All the things we do with Up are sort of, different than other banks. And so the design aspect, the user experience aspect actually became the key element, because when you're carrying your phone in your pocket and you're doing everything with your finger on your phone or with your face or with your voice, that user experience became so much more important than a web browser with a mouse and a keyboard. It just changed the whole game.
There's so many things I want to ask about this. Firstly, how much did Bendigo Bank understand that essentially what you were saying is you can invest into this idea that we've got, that we're going to create, because they did sort of invest early, I think, in helping you get up kind of going. But we need to be Jetstar over here. We don't want to be Qantas. We don't want to be part of Bendigo Bank and its infrastructure and all the problems or perceived problems with the bricks and mortar bank. We want to be a little digital hub innovation thing over here, creating this mobile experience. And so how willing were they to let you do that? And my second question is really, how genius was it for you to do that, given, of course, Bendigo Bank could give you what you didn't want to do, which is deal with banking regulation and all of the laws and legislation around that?
Yeah, so it's awesome. I mean, Bendigo have been extraordinary. Along that journey of the first 6 years, that's where we developed the relationship, the trust and everything. And we structured our business so that we owned the IP and we licensed it back into Bendigo, and Bendigo paid us a fee to build it. And so we were, bootstrapped for 10 years, and we were a very profitable business, or at least we had heaps of revenue. We reinvested it all back into growing the team and growing the business. But, right from day one, we had revenue. And so the big part that Bendigo played in the first 6 years was our survival. In the last 4 years, the big part they've played is supporting us and being an extraordinarily brave organisation and brave group of people to back this crazy team. At the time, we might have been 15, 20 people, something like that. For us to sort of continue building the fifth biggest banking platform in Australia, we do about $10 or $12 billion a month with 2 million customers, to keep building that, and also to build by far Australia's best and biggest digital bank, but potentially, one of the best in the world, to do both of those things at the same time with less than 30 people, it's quite extraordinary. So for Bendigo to actually back that and believe that, I think that's the first part of the answer, is that they had this sort of belief in us. And then in the last 4 years, the second part of the story, we actually did a joint venture, and we set up, we talked to the regulators. We probably spent about a year working out how could you launch a bank without a banking license? How can a fintech and a bank collaborate? And so we created an unincorporated joint venture, which gave Bendigo all the rights that they needed to have in order to satisfy the regulators, and gave us all the rights that we needed to have to maintain the intellectual property and then to share that with Bendigo. So there was a juncture, a moment in time, where Bendigo essentially became a joint intellectual property holder with us, and that became the sort of formation of this new partnership in order to launch Up in a way that was different than how we'd done it in the first 6 years. And that really was extraordinary, that they gave us that opportunity and that chance. And it culminated with them buying our business last year when we had 63 people.
The other question I have about that is, as you get close to launch, and, you obviously have a lot of passion for this mobile banking app, but what was it like the night before launch? You're going to the customer with quite a revolutionary way to do their banking. And people are so I mean, this is changing where generations change, but people really think about what's the serious option or what's the trusted and credible option with my money, right? So people have vested interest in sticking with the old because they know it and they don't want to take a risk with their money. Whereas you're giving them this new thing that looks different, it feels different, it's bright and colourful and simple to use, etc. But ultimately, I'd never heard of a thing called UpBank, So how did you convince customers to use it, and what did it feel like? How nerve-wracking was it in the days leading up to the launch? Did you think it was going to work?
I mean, we always thought it was going to work, but we also knew it could fail. I think that having permission to fail and having failed before, gives you sort of a good foundation for success. And this is an answer to your question is how did it feel on the night before? The night before was a year. So we actually launched it to ourselves in late September of 2017. And the idea was that 25 Ferocians would access Up and we would use it as our bank. And we all got to play with it. And then we got 25 Bendigans to join. And then we got our family and friends, which was 250 people. So we had another 200. And then we went out to a broader group of, we had, tens of thousands of people on the wait list. And we went out to a broader group. Now, that all happened over a year. It was 2,500. So we ended up on the night before launch with around 2,500 customers already using it. So that year was a year to engage with the regulators, to get the structure and the joint venture right, to build the solution, to make sure it was well funded, to get feedback from customers, to create a customer support network. We needed to have essentially a real-time customer support network for when we launched. And so actually the night before I slept like a baby. And it was an amazing launch because it was quirky and it was weird and it was different. But we invited every single journalist in Melbourne on the 9th of October. And then on the 10th of October, we flew up to Sydney and we did the same thing again in Sydney. And we invited Apple and Google and all these people to come along and the regulators and every journalist that we could get their phone number or their email address. And so that seems quite daunting, but because we had a year leading up to that, it was almost just a natural extension. I'd been telling 2,500 people how great Up was that I'd almost lost my voice by then. And then telling all these industry players and all these journalists how great it was just really easy. It almost came naturally. My business partner for 15 years, Tomo, we had several different businesses together, but we did Up, and he used to say all the time that the word that describes it best is bravery. Bendigo were extraordinarily brave to back two blokes, which became a proof of concept with 6 people, which became, a 15 to 20, 25, 30 people, which then ended up launching, potentially one of the greatest banks of this generation. So that is an extraordinary brave thing for 160. Actually, next year they're 165. So 164-year-old bank to go through that journey is just out of control.
Dom Pym's one of the brains behind the mobile-only UpBank, and you're just about to hear how crucial this relationship with Tomo, Grant Thomas, has been, not just to this great business success, but also in an international deal that went wrong and almost took them to the brink of collapse. That's all next on Curveball. Fintech entrepreneur Dom Pym was on a high in the late 2000s. His first few businesses had catapulted him to the top of a fairly exclusive world of high-profile investors and entrepreneurs, people looking for the next big tech innovation. But Dom had an idea which was called ClearGrain. Now, this was the company, Dom, that you ran before UpBank with Tomo. What was ClearGrain?
I mean, in a nutshell, it was the world's first online grain exchange. So it was quite a revolutionary idea. People had tried before, but they'd never succeeded. And so we weren't the first to come up with the idea, the broad idea, but we were the first to execute it really well. And we did patent a lot of the technologies that we developed. So you can actually, have a look and search around. You can find the patents and things. But to take a sort of what happens every day in the stock market where people buy and sell stocks and you don't literally get it delivered to your house. You sort of buy the stocks and you own them in a virtual ledger, and the money changes hands and you get a dividend and all that sort of stuff. We wanted to apply that same sort of logic, but instead of to companies, to physical commodities like grain. And it does prove to be quite difficult, which we learned. We knew nothing about grain at the time. It proves to be quite difficult because, for example, the farmers grow the grain, they harvest it, they sort of pray for rain, and then they get rain, they harvest the grain, and they put it all into their local silo, or they can store it on the farm, but it's all commingled together. So how can you say that somebody owns a specific sort of portion of grain or bunch of sort of grain? It's a very difficult thing to do. So we sort of invented this idea, something we called the G ticket, and the G ticket is a way to have almost like a mortgage where you own that pile of grain, but when it gets taken out of the silo and put into the truck, you're not getting back the same bits of grain. You're just getting some commingled grain. And so we created this idea that you would own a portion. So that there might be, say, 10 tons or 100 tons of grain, and you would have a digital allocation, like a title, to 1 ton of that or 5 tons of that or whatever. And then when that came out of the silo, you actually had an ownership document which actually said, this is actually your grain, even though it's commingled and it's maybe 1,000 different farmers' grain. That sounds like a very simple concept when I describe it now, but back then no one had worked out how to do that. And we worked that out. And so we built a sort of a digital platform, a web-based platform that allowed every farmer in Australia to be able to take ownership of their commingled grain. And then in the demise of the AWB, the Australian Wheat Board, they were able to maintain ownership over it as it travelled through the logistics system and on its way to the rest of the world. And Australia is like the 3rd largest grain exporter in the world. So we're talking millions and millions of tonnes of grain here.
You had some financial backing for this company, but you ended up selling it to the New Zealand Stock Exchange for a couple of $1 million, I think, only, 18 months after starting this. Why sell so early?
Well, there's probably 2 things there interesting. So we started by building the software for the stock market. We weren't actually building it for grain. In the first instance, we were building it for the stock market, and we were pitching it to CommSec and E-Trade and NAB and Westpac and all these companies that were running sort of online brokers. And one of our early investors was the managing director of the largest private company and one of the largest commodities trading companies in the world. So a company called Glencore. And so he sort of said to us, hey, can you do what you're doing in the stock market, but can you do it in grain? So then we met with some other people who became our co-founders, and we set up a little, a company, a team to be able to do that. So in the first instance, doing what we were doing in grain was unusual, and we invented some interesting things. Those people that funded us, they really backed us. So we put our own money in, but we also teamed up with investors, and even the staff invested in the company. So we ended up with a sort of a cap table, they call it, like a share register of maybe approximately 20 people or 20 organizations or people or family offices or whatever. And then it was going so well that people all around the world started noticing. We did an exclusive agreement with GrainCorp, which were the largest grain handler in Australia on the East Coast. And there was another one in South Australia, which was at the time, I think it became Vatira, and then another one in the West Coast called CBH, or the Cooperative Bulk Handling. And we went around and met all those grain companies, and then we did an exclusive agreement with GrainCorp on the East Coast of Australia. So anywhere in Victoria, Queensland or New South Wales, you basically use our platform to buy and sell your grain. And so we very, very quickly scaled the business and scaled the team, and we needed more and more capital as we kept growing, like any startup does. And then we got approached almost out of the blue to sell the company. So it was more than a couple of million. It was about $27 million, as I recall. So it was a decent chunk of money that we were offered 16 months after we started the company.
So you sold, you did the deal. Then what went wrong? Because I think it kind of came unstuck in the selling process.
I mean, we don't talk a lot about it because it was a pretty harrowing experience, but I think it was really definitely one of the curveballs in my life. But it was also an experience that I'm proud to have come through as a foundational learning experience. You have successes and you have failures. And along the way, we've had some failures. And the sale of this business was one of the biggest failures of our lives. But it was also one of the biggest learning experiences of our lives. And I put it down to a cultural mismatch. When a stock exchange, a regulated stock exchange, and a very well-recognised company in New Zealand buys a little startup out of Melbourne with maybe, I think at the time we had 30, 32 people, we were all about building mobile apps and building web platforms and innovating and disrupting and all this sort of stuff. When you get similar to what we talked about with Bendigo and Ferocia, when you get the Clear Grain Exchange, and we call ourselves Clear Interactive, this crazy group of sort of the best technologists that I've worked with in the world, when you get those people and then you get a stock exchange, it didn't seem dumb at the time. It seemed like it was a great matchup, but there was just such a cultural mismatch that I don't think there was any way it was going to work. And I'll just put it in perspective for people and for yourself, is that Tomo and I spent millions and millions of dollars fighting that situation and spent about 5 years of our lives trying to get back on track. And so it's hard to talk about. It's very emotional, but I think it's a really valuable learning experience for someone at my age to have gone through. Probably more difficult. Tomo's 20 years older than me, and I think that he was in the prime of his career, and it's a really devastating thing to have gone through. And it wasn't just us; every single staff member was a shareholder, so everybody got dragged into it. The acquisition went really badly. Everybody was gone within the first 5 weeks. People started getting fired within 5 months. Some people had to stick around for 5 years before they. We certainly couldn't approach them or anything like that. So, yeah. Very, very difficult. Don't talk about it a lot, but a very valuable life experience. And I look back on it as an expensive learning experience. But I have this sort of philosophy in life that you can read as many books as you like and other people can tell you how to do something. But until you get that practical experience and you do it for yourself, like I stood up in the courtroom and gave witness testimony being cross-examined by, QCs. And even the judge, was asking questions and everything. And to go through that experience in the High Court of New Zealand, we were the first court case in New Zealand to be streamed on the web. That's history. Like, we literally made history. And
Claim to fame there.
Yeah, and in the end, it was a really weird outcome because nobody won and nobody lost. It was a 0-0 draw. And there's I don't know how many pages. I say 100 pages, but that might be an exaggeration. It might have been 30 or 50. But there's this huge finding from the High Court of New Zealand as to the acquisition and who did what and what went well and what didn't. And the final findings are nobody gets anything, nobody wins. And literally says it's a 0-0 draw. So to go through that experience and to fight for what we believed in and to fight for all of the staff and all of the shareholders and then to come up and not win, but at the same time not lose, you can't pay for that. You can't read that in a book. You have to, that's lived experience. Without actually going through that, there's just no way to describe how that changes your life.
I can see even today how much that broke you, but I'm interested in what it was that meant you could get back in the saddle and do another thing like Upbank. It always shocks me the amount of people who come on Curveball who've done something amazing and they're now heralded in the press as, wonderful and they've earned millions of dollars. But when you dig into their story, there's often a moment like this where they are on the brink of collapse. How do you rally from that and do it all over again?
I think surrounding yourself with people that are better than yourself is rule number one. For me, Tomo was my rock. Whether we sort of think of, we're 15 years working together, it's like a marriage. And so whether we don't talk about it a lot publicly, but just, what we do say is that we helped each other to get through those 15 years, through the ups and downs. And we had some successes. We had one business that we exited, another business that sort of fizzled into not much, and then another business which became Up eventually, Ferocia and Up. And so I think, during those ups and downs, we're always there for each other, regardless of good times or bad times, and not just each other, but also our families. And then our friends and our colleagues, like I said before very casually, but a lot of the people that worked in our other projects ended up working on now Up. When I'm walking down the street now, people come up to me and say, "Hey, are you the co-founder of Up?" Or, "Hey, are you Dom? Are you that Up guy?" And it's like being sort of a mini celebrity or something. It's out of control. People high-fiving me walking down Collins Street, and I always wear my Up t-shirt and people just know who I am. So I call it the 20-year overnight success. Like, you can't have had Up without the relationship between me and Tomo. You can't have had Up without 20 years of hard work, blood, sweat and tears.
You also had a company called Zudio, which was sort of around music, and I understand you don't even like music. What did you learn from running that company that you took forward?
Yeah, well, that was interesting too. It actually ties back into SAP. On my very first day at SAP, I went into I'd done the interviews and I got the job and everything, and I went in for my first day, and I think I would have had a suit and a tie on, and I'm carrying my little briefcase and everything, feeling very professional. And I went into the lift, and I bumped into this guy, Andrew, and we had a yarn. I reckon it was 10 or 15 years later, he said to me, "Hey, I'm in a band." I mean, I sort of knew he was doing music stuff. He said, "Hey, I'm in a band and, I'm thinking about touring." And I'd by then moved overseas and everything. So I was in Singapore And I said, I'd love to help you. And so I helped sort of manage the band from Singapore, and I wrote some software. It was called Band Manager. And it was helping the band to sort of organise their finances and organise their website and, get to sound check on time and organise their tours and sell their merch and all this sort of stuff. And then one day, Andrew said to me, "Hey, Dom, I'm thinking about leaving SAP." And I said, "Oh, what are you going to do?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm thinking about starting a record label." Really? That's crazy. I never liked music. I'm not into music at all. I never had a sort of record player or CD player or anything like that. And so Andrew told me he had this crazy idea that he wanted to quit SAP and start a record label. And so I said, "No worries, let's do it. Let's do it together." And so we left. We both left SAP. We started a record label. And then we ended up with this other guy. His real name's David, but his stage name was Frank. And we went up to him and had a chat with him, and he ran a little music school out of his backyard, like sort of in his, bedroom or whatever. And he had maybe 30 or 40 students that he was teaching to play guitar and teaching to play the drums and stuff like that. He was just a music teacher. And a lot of music teachers work out of their home. And so we asked him if he wanted to come in as the third partner to start this independent record label. And we grew his music school from 40 kids to 800 and opened up several locations. And then we built a recording studio, and then we built a multimedia studio, and then we started producing music, and then we became the first iTunes content aggregator in Australia. And then we toured with Jimmy Barnes and John Farnham and Delta Goodrem and Machine Gun Falacio and I don't know, all these amazing things. And so over probably 8 years or so, we went from a couple of guys quitting SAP to a number one song in the charts. We had a number two, a couple of number threes. We're in the hottest 100. We were touring around Australia on the radio, all sorts of crazy things. And yeah, it sort of was a little bit weird and a bit out of control, but that's actually where I recruited a lot of the people that work with us now. The other thing I'm passionate about is that all the people that worked at Zudio have now gone on to do incredible things. I actually met someone at AFL House recently, and he sort of reached out and he goes, "Do you remember me? I used to be a music school at Zudio Music, and we had Mr. Music was our sort of brand, and then I've got Lindsay Adams, who you can look up in IMDb, and I bought him his first computer, his first MacBook, and some software called Shake and whatever. And he was helping us make music videos. And he made music videos for our bands in our little independent record label. But then he started making music videos for Warner and others and record label brands and bands. And then he went on to make all sorts of things that you might have heard of, like The Matrix or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or whatever, Harry Potter. Like he made Gollum in Lord of the Rings. And so like I'm really proud that a bunch of like my business partner, in fact, met his wife and they've now got kids and everything, through the record label. And so it sort of changed a whole lot of people's lives, from the music teachers to the graphic designers, the multimedia people, the software developers, and all those people have gone on to do some amazing things, whether it be in sport or whether it be in the movies or whether it be at Up, now, working in software or fintech. That was just a little warehouse that we bought down in Notting Hill with our own money that we'd saved up from working at SAP, fully self-funded. We didn't have any investors at all. And after about 8 years or so, we sort of sold the business, sold the music school back to Dave, and sold the warehouse to another guy, a builder, and there you go. I sort of quit all of that when I met Tomo. Tomo and I decided to start a company together, and Andrew wanted to go back to SAP, and David wanted to go back to teaching music. And so we sold off all the bits and pieces, and I still have the domain names. Like I still keep zudio.com.au and bandmanager.com.au, and Gus and Frank was our number one hit, so we keep Gus and Frank and all that. So yeah, it's just an amazing sort of journey, and the people we met and the lives we changed in that sort of early sort of stage between SAP and Up. It was just incredible. Yeah.
It's so funny that you say all this, because I think we do have this mythology now around all the cool innovation happens in Silicon Valley and places like that, maybe Ireland during the height of the .com boom. But Australia has produced a lot of world-class, particularly fintech businesses of late, things like Afterpay, Xero. Is this, Upbank, is there something special in the Aussie startup space that means we can really punch above our weight?
Oh, yeah, I think there is. I think it's magical. I think, the most well-known would be Google Maps, invented in Sydney. Google Maps is sort of ubiquitous. It's sort of like on every Android and every iPhone in the world, and people think, Google created it. They didn't. They bought it from a couple of Australian blokes that created it. So I think that our ability to create things like carbon fiber, or our ability to create Wi-Fi, or our ability to create Google Maps, It makes the Afterpays and the Atlassians and the Canvas and all that, sort of puts them into perspective. I think Australia has an ability to punch far beyond our weight. Certainly, if you think about us as a sort of global player, a lot of the engineering talent and a lot of the innovative talent coming out of our universities. Jack Dorsey, founder of Twitter and Square, he recognised it. He's got his whole Square Cash App team here in Melbourne building the Cash App, and it's not even available in Australia. It was originally only in the US. I think it's in Canada and the UK and some other places now. But it's probably the biggest and fastest growing fintech and certainly the financial platform in the world. Like 50 million active monthlies, probably something like that, 100 million users, whatever it is, it's out of control. And it's all built here in Australia. So I think that the talent that we have and the sort of go-get-'em attitude and the curiosity and the ability for Australians to just have a crack at things and get back up off their feet when they fall over, and the mateship that we have with our colleagues and our friends. Our colleagues become our friends, and you end up having your Sunday barbecue and going to the footy with each other and all that sort of stuff. So I think that sort of that culture, the Australian sort of camaraderie, the Australian mateship, I think it's something that we should absolutely leverage. And we're working on some things at the moment to try and help improve, the sort of, I guess, the destination of Australia as a place to innovate. Like right now, we have the opportunity for, all the, $40 billion Afterpay sale. It's the biggest, I think it's 39, but it's the biggest sale in Australian history, I'm pretty sure. So, our view is that if we can get all of those success stories, and they don't have to be just fintech, but Canva and Atlassian and Bardo and all that, if we can all invest in the future, then we can create multi-generational wealth and money flows. And if we can do that, then we can actually generate an ecosystem that is as strong as Silicon Valley. So yeah, I hope that in generations to come, we can be much more competitive on a global scale, and I think we already are.
That's Dom Pym, one of Australia's leading fintech entrepreneurs and the man behind UpBank. Next time on Curveball, I'm going to introduce you to Kath Koshal. She's a former cricket player who survived all kinds of tragedy and trauma. But instead of her grief taking her to the brink, she decided to prove to the world that you can actually live on the kindness of others.
That night, I was very surprised to receive off a friend going, "How funny is your brother?" And I was like, "What? Like I'm about to face amputation. What the hell is this person talking about?" And I clicked open the invite that he'd sent to everyone. And it was an invitation, and it had legs all over it, and it simply read, "You're invited. Kath's last day with 2 legs barbecue." And I just honestly wet myself.
Oh,
and I was
my
just like, this is too great. I love this so much.
That's Kath Koshal from The Kindness Factory, an incredible story that's coming up on Curveball. Curveball's produced by Dead Set Studios. Make sure you're following the show so you never miss an episode. And for more information, or maybe you want to suggest a guest, you can head to curveballshow.com. This episode was produced by Grace Pashley, editing by Travis Vettier. The executive producers for Curveball are myself and Rachel Fountain.